Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're heading into a world of South Korean politics. And let me tell you, things have been anything but quiet over there.
It's definitely not quiet.
So, get this. President Yoon Seok-yeol declared martial law.
Whoa!
And then, almost as quickly as he declared it, he had taken it back. Public outcry.
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine. That's a pretty drastic move.
Right. It definitely raised some eyebrows, to
Yo.
say the least. So that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today. Why would a president in a democracy even think about pulling a lever like that? What does it tell us about where South Korea is at politically? And maybe the biggest question, what does this whole thing mean for the future of democracy in the region? I mean, is it as stable as we think?
You know, it's really interesting because I think that this whole situation kind of taps into a deep-seated anxiety that a lot of people in South Korea feel. To really grasp how big of a deal Yoon's actions were, we need to understand the historical context.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of history, there's that South Korean film that came out last year, the one about the assassination of President Park Chung-hee back in '79 and the military coup that happened afterward.
Oh, right.
Can you imagine what went through people's minds when, all these years later, their president suddenly throws out the martial law card? It's like, whoa, this is happening again.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a chilling parallel. I bet for a lot of South Koreans, hearing that declaration brought back some really tough memories, of a pretty dark time in their history. I mean, think about it. The last time they had martial law was back in 1980 under a full-blown military dictatorship.
Right, yeah.
So no wonder people were on edge.
Totally.
Yeah.
The speed at which this whole thing unfolded is just mind-blowing. Yoon declares martial law, then lawmakers are like, nope, not happen, and vote unanimously to block it. And then, boom, he's got to retract it. It was political whiplash.
Yeah.
So what's the fallout? What happens next after a roller coaster ride like that?
Well, the immediate consequence. You've got 6 opposition parties now calling for Yoon's impeachment.
Whoa.
And it doesn't stop there. People are talking about treason charges, not just against Yoon, but some of his key ministers, too.
Treason. Wow, that's huge. It sounds like even his own party is backing away slowly. What's that say about where he stands now?
It's not looking good for him, that's for sure. To really understand how big this situation is, we need to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture of South Korea's political history. It's a wild ride. Coups, imprisonments, impeachments, even an assassination.
Lead the way. I'm ready to dive into this history.
All right, so let's go back to the beginning. South Korea gets its independence from Japan after World War II. Their first president, forced into exile. A student revolt in 1960.
Wow.
Less than 2 years later, his successor gets kicked out in a coup.
Yeah, not exactly a smooth start.
You can say that again. Talk about setting the stage for some serious instability. Yeah, right. And then comes Park Chung-hee, the authoritarian leader we mentioned earlier. He's in charge for 18 years before he's assassinated in '79, which then triggers that military coup and, yep, you guessed it, martial law.
So this whole thing with Yoo Chang-un,
Yeah.
it's like a ghost from the past coming back to haunt them. It makes you wonder just how solid their democracy really is.
Exactly. And right on the heels of that, we have the Gwangju uprising in 1980.
Oh, right. Gwangju. That's often seen as like this turning point in their story, right? Why was it such a big deal for South Korea's path to becoming a democracy?
Well, picture this. Student-led pro-democracy protests break out in Gwangju. Chun Doo-won, he's in charge of the military at the time, and he just cracks down hard. Almost 200 people died. It left these deep scars, on the whole nation. It's a harsh reminder of what happens when you let authoritarian rule take over.
Yeah, that's a tragedy that would stick with the country for a long time.
Yes.
How did they finally make that jump to democracy?
It was a long, hard road, fueled by these relentless pro-democracy movements and a public that just wouldn't give up. Finally, by the late 80s, they held their first open presidential elections, a huge turning point.
So they finally get a taste of democracy. But I'm guessing it wasn't all sunshine and roses from there.
You're right. I mean, South Korea developed a lot of the hallmarks of a strong democracy, like free speech, fair elections, peaceful transitions of power. But, politics there stayed really polarized.
I see.
And that division, that's something that's continued to haunt South Korea even to this day.
It almost sounds like reaching the top spot, becoming president, is a risky business in South Korea.
You're not wrong. There's this disturbing pattern of South Korean presidents facing, impeachment and prosecution after they leave office. Take Roh Moo-hyun, for example, president from 2003 to 2008.
Okay.
Tragically, he committed suicide while he was under investigation for alleged corruption, and this was after his term was over.
Wow. That's a stark reminder of how high the stakes are in South Korean politics.
Absolutely. And then you have his successor, Lee Myung-bak, sentenced to 15 years in prison for corruption after he stepped down.
Wait, so 2 out of the last 3 presidents face those kinds of consequences. That's pretty intense.
It is. And then you throw Park Geun-hye into the mix. She was Park Chung-hee's daughter, the first female president of South Korea.
Oh, right.
But she was impeached by the National Assembly, a scandal involving her top aide, ended up sentenced to 24 years for corruption and abuse of power, although she was pardoned later.
It's wild how things come full circle in South Korean politics. Park Chung-hee assassinated, his daughter impeached decades later, and now the current president causing a stir with this whole martial law declaration. Is this like a South Korea thing, or do we see this pattern elsewhere?
To really understand this pattern, it helps to look at the work of Professor Leif Erik Easley. He's an expert on Korean politics at Ewha University in Seoul. He argues that South Korean democracy, it operates on these incredibly high stakes, both for the leaders and for the people.
Okay, I'm listening. What does he mean by that?
Well, he points out that political parties there, they often revolve around these charismatic individuals rather than, stable ideologies or policy platforms. It's more about personality than policy, which can lead to all sorts of instability and make it hard for presidents to build lasting support from the public.
Almost like a cult of personality.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the media is constantly on the lookout for scandals, and the public isn't shy about taking to the streets. So presidents are under this immense pressure to keep a spotless image and avoid even a hint of controversy.
So it's a system that almost sets them up to fail.
That's one way to look at it. Easley also talks about the long shadow of South Korea's authoritarian past. The president, they have a ton of power, but they only get 1 5-year term.
So not much time to get things done and make a lasting mark.
Exactly. So you have this concentration of power, but for a very limited time. And that can create, well, let's just say it creates opportunities for things to go wrong.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's that pressure cooker, high stakes, tight timelines, and constant scrutiny that makes being president in South Korea so precarious.
This is all fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
But it feels like we're just scratching the surface here. What happens to President Yoon? And what does this all mean for the future of democracy in South Korea?
Ooh, good questions. And you know what? We are going to tackle those right now. No need to wait for the next part.
Yeah, this is a big moment for Yoon, no doubt. And for South Korea as a whole, really. I mean, that martial law declaration, even though he walked it back, it's got his political future hanging in the balance.
Yeah, you can really see how this event has kind of exposed these cracks in South Korea's democracy,
Absolutely. And the fallout from it, it's still shaking things up. Remember, it's not just the opposition that wants him gone. He's got people in his own party calling for his resignation, too.
Right. Even his own team is distancing themselves. That's gotta sting. And then there's that whole treason thing hanging over his head. It's serious business, for sure, and it shows just how bad the situation is. The Democracy Party, they're the main opposition, and they're already moving to make those treason charges official, not just for Yoon, but for his defense minister and the interior minister, too.
So what's next for Yoon? Can he actually survive this, or is his presidency pretty much toast?
Let's just say his political future is on life support right now. Those calls for him to step down, they're getting louder every day.
Feels like the whole country's holding its breath, waiting to see what happens.
It's a tense time, for sure. Even his own party, the People Power Party, they're thinking about demanding that his whole cabinet resign. And that includes firing his defense minister.
Whoa, they want a total reset. That's a pretty big move.
It is. They're trying to cut ties with Yoon, see if they can save themselves from this whole mess.
This whole thing really highlights that tension in South Korea, They have these democratic ideals, but there's that history, that authoritarian past, always lurking in the background.
You hit the nail on the head. It's this constant battle to balance those two forces. On one hand, you've got this lively democracy, free speech, fair elections, peaceful transitions of power. But on the other hand, there's that legacy of authoritarianism, that focus on strong leaders, centralized power, and, a tendency towards things getting a bit unstable.
So it's like these two opposing forces are constantly pulling South Korean politics in different directions.
That's a great way to put it. South Korea's story is a fascinating example of how messy building a democracy can be, especially in a country that's gone through such rapid change and upheaval.
It's a good reminder that democracy isn't like a finish line. It's a journey with all sorts of twists and turns along the way. And what we're seeing in South Korea shows that even democracies that seem pretty stable can be vulnerable, to those echoes of the past and temptation to go back to those quick authoritarian fixes.
Exactly. It's so important to learn from history and to protect those democratic institutions, those norms that keep things running smoothly.
So what's in store for democracy in South Korea? What does the future hold?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we're going to dig into in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at what might happen next and what this political crisis means in the long run.
It really does feel like South Korea is at a crossroads here. The choices they make in the next few days, the next few weeks, they can have a huge impact on where the country goes from here.
No doubt about it. And before we wrap up this part of the conversation, I want to leave you with something to think about. Can South Korea break free from that cycle, that back and forth between democracy and authoritarianism? Can they build a future that's more stable, more democratic, more sustainable? Only time will tell.
As we've been talking about all this political drama, I keep thinking about the people in South Korea. They've seen so much change, so much turmoil. I wonder how this whole thing with Yoon, this martial law thing, how's that affected their faith in democracy?
That's a really important point. Public trust, that's the bedrock of any democracy. If that starts to crumble, well, things can go south pretty quickly.
Especially in a place like South Korea, where those memories of authoritarian rule, they're still pretty fresh for a lot of people.
Exactly. That martial law declaration, even though it was short-lived, it definitely stirred up some old anxieties. And it's made people question, how strong their democracy really is.
So let's talk about what might happen next. What are the different ways this could all play out?
Well, one scenario is that Yoon somehow manages to cling to power. Maybe he makes some concessions, shakes up his cabinet, issues a public apology, something like that. But even if he does weather the storm, his authority would be pretty shot. It'd be tough for him to actually govern effectively.
So he'd be in office, but not really in charge, kind of stuck in political limbo.
Exactly. And that could easily lead to more instability, more gridlock. It would make it even harder to deal with the problems the country's facing.
Right. And then there's the impeachment scenario, which seems to be gaining some momentum. What's that process like? How likely is it to actually happen?
Impeachment in South Korea, it's a complicated process. Needs a two-thirds majority vote in the National Assembly. Given how things are right now, all the opposition to Yoon, it's definitely a real possibility. But impeachment is inherently political. There's no guarantee how it'll turn out.
So it'd be a long, drawn-out fight with no clear winner at the end.
Yep, pretty much. And even if Yoon were impeached, it's not like there's someone obvious waiting to take over. South Korean politics, it's pretty fractured right now.
So what you're saying is they could be heading into a period of, well, just a whole lot of uncertainty and political chaos.
That's definitely on the table. And all that uncertainty, it could easily spill over into the economy, which is already facing some challenges.
It's a lot for any country to handle. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by, just how resilient the South Korean people are. They've been through so much on their road to democracy, but they keep pushing for a better future.
It's pretty inspiring, their spirit. And even with all these challenges right now, I think there's hope. I think South Korea can find a way to get through this and come out stronger on the other side.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners today?
I'd say it's this. Democracy, it's something we need to cherish, but it's also fragile. It needs constant attention, constant care. What's happening in South Korea, it's a wake-up call. Even in democracies that seem solid, the past can come back to haunt you. And when people lose faith in their institutions, well, those authoritarian shortcuts can start looking pretty tempting.
It's a lesson for all of us, really. Not just South Korea, anyone who believes in democratic principles, in the rule of law.
Absolutely. And as we close out our deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought. This crisis, as tough as it's been, maybe it can be a chance for South Korea to really look in the mirror, to think about how to make their democracy stronger in the long run. Maybe it's a chance for some real, meaningful reforms. Who knows? Only time will tell.
That's a great question to leave everyone with. It's been an amazing journey exploring South Korean politics. We've seen how the past shapes their present, how power works there, and all the uncertainty they're facing right now. It reminds us that democracy, it's always a work in progress. It needs our attention, our understanding, and our active participation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time with another fascinating topic to explore.